All right, so it's my pleasure. Well, first of all, welcome back to a new year, a new semester, a new seminar series. It's really great to
scoot over so the Zoom folks can see you.
It's really great to have a room with so many people, and I know that there are also a lot of attendees on Zoom, so this is a great way to kick off our seminar series. So I am delighted to introduce Dr. Lisa Castle. She did her graduate work here actually at KU and graduated with her PhD in 2006. She was mentored by Kelly Kincher and Brian Foster, and she's working at KBS again now, working on a lot of ethnobotany projects, some undergraduate research programs. But prior to coming back here, she was a biology professor at a couple of regional universities in West Virginia and Oklahoma. She's also currently teaching field classes in the environmental studies program. So it's great to have you back, and she's going to share her expertise on prairie turnips. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank all of you for coming. One of the things that I do well is talk about plants, and figured that if I was going to talk about plants and people were going to ask me to do it, that I should get as many folks here as possible. So besides the regular KBS crowds, you'll also notice that you're surrounded by people from my aqua aerobics class, people from the Grassland Heritage Foundation, and people that I just talked to on the street because I think that prairie turnips are fascinating. But they're also misnamed, hard to find, culturally significant, and only sometimes tasty. So what I'm going to talk to you about is the problems with prairie turnips. And basically, I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite plants with a structure of they're problematic. Starting with their name. And then how fascinating they are, but how that doesn't translate to anyone wanting to pay to research them. How everybody loves them, but they're hard to find and slow to grow. And that they are a bad model species, which I suggest makes them a good model because everything is a bad model. But as we go through, this is where we're headed. But first problem, the name. This is the up-close glamour shot of a prairie turnip inflorescence. They don't often look quite this vibrant, but if you had introductory botany class, those are distinctively pea flowers. And turnips, well, they're cruciferous, and the mustard family have 4 little petals and a cross. Not a turnip. They do grow on the prairie, but they're an edible legume, and they're a perennial, unlike garden turnips, which are annual plants. And prairie turnip is only one of a whole bunch of bad names that have been used for them. The official USDA common name is large Indian breadroot, which the roots are used for food, high in carbohydrates. We'll give them that. Indian potato, of which there are at least 5 other plants with that common name. Not to mention, of course, we're nowhere near India. Pomme blanche, which does translate as white apple, and white apple has been used. And sort of my favorite because it's descriptive but does not roll off the tongue, breadroot scurf pea. These are plants native to the prairies of the US and southern Canada, and all of the people of the prairies have used them and have names for them. These are a few. They're certainly not a comprehensive list. The one that I use the most is Iha, because it's short and I can say it. And also goes, it's the crow name, and I worked with a crow family that harvested many of these. The others are all valid, good names, but if names are to communicate, they often don't communicate outside of a group. So we call them, what do we call them? And does it even matter? And I say it does matter. This is on a Lakota culture website that's talking about how amazing these plants are. The other photographs on the site all include prairie turnips. You probably haven't seen a roasted prairie turnip because they're very rarely roasted, but they would not look like that. Those are garden turnips that roasted. And on this webpage, I was poking around at the North Dakota Heritage site, looking at, they have a great collection of photographs from the Northern Plains, including this one, which someone had written on somewhere in the print, Indian turnip. And so the summary description talks about Indian turnips, which is Jack in the Pulpit, which is that plant, which looks nothing like the plant in the photograph, which is in fact, I use prairie turnip because it's the easiest thing, but Pediomelum esculentum. But when people in official documents start describing plants based on a name as something else that is poisonous, when it's an edible plant, there are problems. So first problem is that names can be misleading. And as it happens, people in my lab that I am working with are collaborating with the USDA, who maintains the most used database of plant names, and tribes who want to share their plant names to get indigenous names onto the USDA plants website. Unfortunately, our purview of this project doesn't go to like, why would there be a picture of seeds as the identification picture on our plant website, outside of what we're dealing with. But we are hoping to add an ethnobotany tab, and then users could select a language and hear a native speaker say the plant's name from that language, and have places to click more to learn about the uses of that plant that the tribal language program has wanted to share. If you are sitting there thinking, but which of the many words is going to go on there? And I know that in some languages, how women say a plant's name is different than how men do. Which are you going to put there? How are you going to write out plants that don't, for languages that don't have uh, systems that translate into alphabets easily? And what are you going to do if it's like a cilantro coriander problem that has different names for different parts? If you're wondering that, so am I. But I'm working with a team and we're trying to figure out how to do this. We don't know yet. But that is one solution we are working on to the broader problem of names, even though it will not solve for us the problem of what I talk about prairie turnips in a talk. You're probably not aware of it, actually several of you are, but you're hearing from the world's expert on the population dynamics of Pediomelum esculentum, which when I teach undergraduates, I tell them that the first day. They can go home and tell their roommates, you know, I heard from the world's expert on the population dynamics of Pediomelum esculentum this morning, and it has not yet impressed anyone to my knowledge. But I didn't set out to do that. In fact, 25 years ago, when I was looking at graduate schools, I had not heard of it. But the person who I was going to study with had. And I was coming here because there were people at KU, Kelly Kincher in particular, who were looking at plants that people use, edible and medicinal plants, both culturally and importantly, ecologically. And I wanted to be part of that. That at the time, the worldwide focus of ethnobotany, that's what this field is called, was on tropical plants in the rainforest. For good reason, rainforest plants were disappearing quickly, and cultures and languages and knowledge of those plants was also disappearing. But I'm from this part of the world and looked around and like, rainforest is not the only place where habitats are disappearing and knowledge of the plants and organisms of those habitats is also disappearing. So I wanted to work on prairie plants from ecology and ethnobotanical standpoint. And Kelly talked me into prairie turnips because they were, in his description, really fascinating, widespread, and the most important food plant of the prairie. And I'm like, well, I want to work on the most important food plant of the prairie, but they weren't fundable. So I came here, I was going to study echinacea, which is slightly more fundable. But then a second solution came. I received a fellowship, the Lila and Madison Self, not Bill, not myself, fellowship, which supported my graduate efforts for the time that I was here. So Kelly suggested a new solution to the fascinating but unfundable. I should study prairie turnips and two other unfundable things because I had funding. And he had been contacted by herbalist Robin Klein, who took this photo, that Alma Snell, who described herself as a crow ethnobotanist, was wanting someone to write her plant use book or to help her record her plant information. And Kelly volunteered me to go to Montana for the summer. Ended up being for many summers and live with Alma's family and help get her plant use book written. He was also working with the United Plant Savers, who have the goal of conserving medicinal plants of North America while using them. They work with herbalists and try to figure out which plants can be harvested, the best practices for harvesting, which plants can be cultivated, and which plants should be avoided. So they were trying to assess which plants are most vulnerable to overharvest. And I thought, because I was a new graduate student, that I could just use some math to kind of solve both of these. That if we only knew how many plants there are, how long they grow, how often they reproduce, what's their timing of reproduction, how many of the seeds survive the first year, all of these things, then we would have a good idea of what sustainable harvest was. And I still maintain that's true, but we don't even know how many plants there are, much less what's normal for population variations. So I set out to find out. So I had prairie turnips grow across the whole range. So, from Kansas, I could watch plants. I could see them in Nebraska. And then while I was on the Crow Reservation working on book, I could also look at plants there. And the one project came to fruition fairly quickly. This was published in 2006, before Alma passed in 2008. It was her plant use book. Inadvertently, because I had a slightly better digital camera than Alma's family did, I became the photographer for all of the cover shots. But by fall 2000, because of an awkwardly named fellowship, I was able to dive into the fascination without worrying about funding, which led us to the next problem that everybody likes. This was on Fort Berthold in on the Missouri River, where the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people live. And those are prairie turnips in Owl Woman's hand there. Mary Welders Lewis, while eating them across the plains, thought they tasted awfully good. Served them in ragouts and gravies instead of the truffles. And he was not the only one who thought they were really good. The people who live here and continue to live here think that they're very good. One of the great things about prairie turnips as a food source is that they are easily dried and transported. So while they have a really short harvest interval, which we'll talk about, they can be dug up, braided, or dug up and chipped and dried, and moved easily, often used as a carbohydrate to add to a dried meat stew over the winter. That you have bison, need something more. And prairie turnips fill that in. Being legumes in the bean family, they have slightly more protein than an average starchy root does. Still mostly starch, but higher in protein. And they have some unusual polysaccharides that make them slow to digest. Through historical records, lots of people use them as foods for invalids and children with upset stomachs. Alma was treating someone with irritable bowel syndrome with prairie turnip as part of their diet. And they've been discussed as part of a diabetes prevention diet as well, in part because of the polysaccharides. They're attractive, my opinion, but you'll see lots of them. And lots of people think that they should be in gardens. How many of you successfully raised a prairie turnip in your garden? Okay. I have briefly also. They're not great garden plants, although I want you to try. And for lots of people, they may not eat them regularly, but they're a symbol of, like on the Crow Reservation, at a feast for a good time or a feast for a bad time, there would be prairie turnips, because this is family. This is, and the woman, LaDonna, that I was working with on the Pine Ridge here, ate them, but mostly just kept the braids because they were. Although her son here was very upset that I was harvesting with him and I was going to learn how to braid rather than letting him eat them fresh out of the ground. Which made me like happy, like 14-year-old who wants to eat vegetables of any culture, anytime. That's an exciting thing. And should note that one of my graduate school friends who had grown up on the Rosebud Reservation very near the Pine Ridge, when I asked her about these, just like, and no, I did not chase the buffalo on the way to work, and I've never had a prairie turnip. So do note that we're talking about huge geographic range, huge diversity of people. And while I say, you know, the Crow eat them like this, that's really Alma's family who eats them like this, who learned from her grandmother. And I don't want to suggest that I have knowledge of how any group of people as a group behaves. But this individual on Pine Ridge was willing to trade me the prairie turnips for Harry Potter 5 that had just come out that week. And I had a copy and he didn't. So there was an established history of trade there. The people on their quantities given from the 1790s, explorers would talk about corn versus burden baskets of prairie turnips, and continue to be that it was a traded commodity across the plains because they're valuable. And people still like prairie turnips. That there's a fry bread company in interior South Dakota that sells, I've had it, it's biscuit mix, it's fry bread mix, but it's, for a long time, their secret ingredient was prairie turnips. There was less than there was the baking soda, so I don't think they affected the taste much, but it made it somehow different and specialized. This is a recent recipe on Forager Chef. And these are the first 2 of 8 YouTube videos I found that are actually about prairie turnips, about the plant I'm talking about. So interest is high and not gone away. And of course, as you will read any local field guide, you will see that prairie turnips were the favorite food of the now extinct plains grizzly bear. I attribute this to a line from the field guides to a line in Kelly's book, which Kelly got from William Clark, from the journals of Lewis and Clark. Debatable whether Clark saw it or there's another captain who, Pallisar, who was reporting on the plains grizzlies pawing prairie turnips. But it's known they were, you know, And grizzlies do definitely dig roots. So I don't know why they wouldn't eat this grape. So I looked at this as a problem. What's the problem if everybody or almost everybody, and yeah, that's the same Meriwether Lewis who thought that they would replace truffles and morels, who said that they were insipid and tasteless. So I don't know. What's the problem? There's a big problem with being popular. Is that they are potentially over-harvested. They are a conservative species, meaning that they don't come back after plowing disturbances, and they're vulnerable to being overgrazed. And if you look at the range map, you think about places that haven't been plowed or heavily grazed or turned into pavement. Across there, there's not a whole lot of places left. So there's not a whole lot of places for them. They're immensely popular. It's possible that they're being over-harvested. So 25 years ago, 24 years ago, I was like, I'm going to find out if they're over-harvested and suggest sustainable practices. Which leads us to the next problem. They're hard to find. First, they're hard to find suitable habitat where they could be. And then once you're there, they're still hard to find. One reason is that they're smaller than the grasses. They live in prairies. There's prairie grasses. There's a prairie turnip right in the middle there. This is a giant prairie turnip. That's a big prairie turnip. For traditional harvesters, there are many stories of the kids being the primary gatherers or finders of the prairie turnips, not say the gatherers. Digging them takes work. But gathering to find, they have these palmate many fingered leaves, and kids would be told that they point to each other, so that they should just go and follow from one to the next. They are also wind dispersed. That's supposed to be the other way around. This will come first. Wind dispersed, that every summer these long-lived plants will break off right about at the soil root level. And I was told that they tumbled. And I envisioned Russian thistle, big tumbleweeds going across, red papers about how many thousands of seeds they will do over the 4 kilometers. People have studied this. And I looked at these, and on my Montana sites, I found some in the yucca or in the skunk bush within 2 meters of my plant that matched the dimensions of the plant I had seen the year before. But this happens, they, in Kansas, will emerge late April, flower in May, and by mid-June, start what's technically called an abscission layer here, similar to what happens when leaves fall. And then the top blows off. It is a great strategy for surviving summer on the prairie. Because where is it when it's not raining in August? It's underground, safe, happy. Where is it when ice storms and blizzards come? That could safe underground. doesn't have, not a lot phases them. Study in early 2000, plants for potential oil field remediations suggested prairie turnips because they were completely unaffected by the presence of oil because they grew so slowly already. They didn't actually make that conclusion. That's my emphasis. But they come up, they grow a little. I've discovered by looking at them that they do have what we think are annual growth rings. And based on those annual growth rings, the smallest of these is 4 years old. And the oldest here is 13. At least it is starting to get pithy, so it might be older than that. In a plot where I weeded and removed competitors, after 3 years, there was nothing that was edible size as far as a root goes. So they are slow growing, and harvest does kill the plant. Note also, these are on the Crow Reservation, where at least Alma's family does not braid, but they also dig in directly in sandstone. We're pulling out a rock. They're not long tails on those. On the pine ridge, it was so much fun to harvest because sandy soil on the pine ridge allows you to pop them up, and they have long tails, and it's actually the extension of the taproot that is what gets braided. So I think there might be a geographical reason for the cultural difference in storage. So these plants, they're hard to find, they're really slow growing, but I still wanted to know how many there were. My solution was to count in a whole bunch of different places, to use models, because I couldn't count enough, to actually talk to harvesters and to mimic their harvest practices. And I went to 3 places. I recorded exactly where individuals were, such that I could see seedlings the next year and figure out, you can't mark a plant that's going to tumble, but I marked corners of plots and had very exacting notes of where they were in the plot, and came back and found that most plants don't change size from one year to the next. In fact, like, number of inflorescences doesn't change. Found some that said in this small juvenile stage for at least 5 years. Yeah, that's an inch tall. Came back and it was there the next year. And then I combined all the information from what happened to every one of these plants that I tracked on 3 places over 4 years, and did a bunch of what at the time was fun math, and now just kind of intimidates me. But came to the conclusion the important value we're comparing here to is 1. So if a population has an eigenvalue from this matrix of 1, it is stable. And if it is greater than 1, it's projected to grow. Less than 1, projected to decline. And from combining a whole bunch of location data, we found that prairie turnips are pretty stable, which I could have told you when I drove all the way back to Montana, and every one of my plants on one hillside was there, and there were no babies, which was interesting, but harder dissertation on. I also went out and I started to figure out, well, the people who harvest, one of the things they say is that there are fewer plants because they're not being harvested. And everyone who harvests thinks that they're helping the population, whether that's purely psychological or that they're stewards of the land. But I went out and I tested, like, does making a hole lead to more survival of seeds the next year? And it does, by a long way. And then I added this into various models and determined that that means the observed effect I saw of these seeds, if that continued, because I didn't have years to see if those still survive, if that continued, that would mean that people could sustainably harvest 20% of the populations every 5 years, as opposed to if they just brought in the tops, did not follow the traditional protocol for when and how to harvest. They would only be able to have 10% of the population, which is enough for several braids difference over time. So this was where I was at the end of my dissertation. Big lessons were that wild harvested plants are poorly studied, but worth studying, but including human interactions leads to a much more complete botanical picture. That was in 2006. And then it came back to the same problem. They're still fascinating, but they're still unfundable. And now I had a job. I hung them on my wall in my office and did get occasional vampire jokes. And I would never understand when people walked into my office and made a vampire joke. Like, oh, you're really afraid of vampires. Like, oh, no, those are not garlic. But they hung in my office. The middle one, or the sad-looking middle one, is the one that I harvested. The others I purchased at either museums or directly from the harvesters. And I did other things during those next 8 years, including teaching all of these classes. Actually, all of those were in the first 8 years. I am not an invertebrate zoologist or a vertebrate zoologist, but until recently, that was the best class I ever taught. It was really good. And I was in Oklahoma, so I attempted to find a fast-growing plant to study if I can get my students out studying it. The vine behind Jamie here is the plant in question. It's a squirting cucumber. It ejects seeds. It has characteristics of edible plants and medicinal plants and invasive plants, and we could use it to model all of them. It's a cool plant. And I, first 4 years, had about 100 plants in the population. We marked every plant in the population. Except for 2011, which was severe drought. We had 12, made sense. And I had budgeted time to count about 100 plants. And then we had close to 400 the year I was doing my tenure documents at the same time. And then in 2019, we had 2,748 plants that we marked. And in 2020, I was home. I had kids who could count plants. I was like, oh, we'll just go count plants all summer and we'll do, within season survivalship curves. There were 2 plants alive in the fall of 2020. And I got called back to revisit that United Plant Savers project of what the at-risk list was. And it was slightly fundable. They said, we'll pay you to finish this project and tell us what's most at risk and a tool we could create. And we used other things because the numbers don't exist, but they paid me to come to Lawrence. And I was like, I remember my dissertation, and I said this is what would happen after 10 years based on these models. It's been 10 years. Why don't I go find out which model is best, and then I can finally publish this information? This Richmond, Kansas population was projected from all of the models to grow. In 2014, in the plots, there were 34 plants where there had been 206. That was a realized growth rate of 0.83. None of the years, even this horrible drought in Montana, had a growth rate that low. So my solution, I'm a scientist, more data needed. And I also took up prairie turnips as a hobby because they're not fundable, but let's make a hobby. I will come to Kansas and see my dear friends, convince them to borrow the survey equipment and go count plants. And I should note that all of these photographs are from recent years when I had my current phone. I took some the ensuing years, but I don't want to say that this was 2014 to 2015. There was slight growth of the population that had crashed between 2004 and 2015. Suggesting then that every year that I watched the population and had year-to-year information, which is the only really good information for making these models, it grew. Yet it crashed somehow. There was a slight decline, 2015 and 2016. And this is the actual years that I've observed this population, and yet in order for the decline we saw, either one of the years had to be really, really, really bad, or every year was worse than what I saw. Yet when I see them, they grow. So what do? We need more data. So we go back. They're a bad model, but they also go dormant. I forgot to mention. It turns out that a plant not only can stay underground for July to April, and does, but plants can stay alive and underground from July till April, 19 months later, and probably July till April, 25 months later, at least 2 years dry. Other plants that we're interested in have these challenging issues. So it wasn't like we shouldn't abandon this, like we should figure out what's going on. So we went back and 2024, we started counting plants outside of the plots also because there were just so few in the plots. But those in the plots, 2024 was at 44, up from 34 in 2014. So growing, because I've been watching it, but down from 206 in 2004. And we went back to the Nebraska site, and we only had a 20-year time span. That's actually supposed to be for 20 years. Between 2004 and 2022, it was stable. So why should we bother if everything is inconclusive or just stable? Well, among other things, if you look closely, you notice weird things. Like this plant was blooming close by in Kansas on May 1st last year. They normally bloom May 19th, my date, because it's my birthday, but it is also when I've observed them. They were much earlier last year. By going this closely, I was comparing my notes to my photographs, and I was like, oh, that's the very, very sad plant that I couldn't find the next year. Right here. It's a very, very sad plant. So I have knowledge that that plant died. And I also have knowledge that this plant was eaten at this size 2 years in a row. I don't know why it's so tasty, but I was like, oh, it must have died because I can't find it. And I look a little more closely. I'm like, hey, there's a little stick. It's still alive. So there's always new information and there's more to learn. And doing that better informs models for all species. And I also just keep learning more from other people doing things. Recently, just read that these being in the pea and bean family have associated with bacteria that fix nitrogen, but that it is a novel vertical transmission, according to this guy's dissertation, who I should have cited, that it comes from parent to seed rather than in the soil. So cool things to find out. I also documented that harvest changed the rest of the community in 2004. I still know where those plots are. If prairie turnips were not completely unfundable, I could go back to those plots and find out if those harvest disturbances changed the community for 20 years. And overall, it is fascinating. But it's still not easily funded, which is why I am working on echinacea again, and not on prairie turnips as my day job. We're learning how different species of echinacea and soil effects on seed chemistry. We're not doing the chemistry, we're growing the plants. So are there any lessons at 24 years? I was going to ask you, but you're not one of my classes. I won't make you say the lessons. But the big lesson is when we watch closely, we learn a lot more. And we can only make models or predictions or conclusions if we have information and if we've observed and watched closely, including learning what we don't know. And the more we know that we don't know, the better answers we can seek. So I'm always for learning more. And I would like to thank the root diggers who were willing to go out with me and share their bounty, as well as some funders, and Jennifer Moody and Debbie Baker, who have, picked up prairie turnips as a hobby as well. And I couldn't possibly do without them. And I'd like to thank you for sharing a bit of my fascination today.
Want to believe that your math models are good. And I wonder, while you weren't looking, whether there is a, if there were these grizzlies around, and they found a bunch of them together, they would wipe it out, right? So what if there's a grizzly equivalent that ate all your turnips while you weren't looking?
That's the question was, if there a grizzly equivalent that ate the turnips. The population at Richmond is not harvested. It's adjacent to the community ball fields. I ask for permission every so often, and I get sort of a look of, well, why are you sitting around in the grass? And, oh, are you still working on that school project? And had there been grizzlies, I think I would have seen signs of it. There was a drought. There was a change in management of the adjacent field. And there was a line of cedars knocked out. So that there's much more potential for herbicide overspray. So I have some hypotheses that there was a horrible event. Our overall population, I mean, the models are good for what they are. I stand by the models, but models are only good for projecting what would happen if these conditions continue. I'm talking to Helen, who taught this to me, that they are not good for saying what will happen, if we start using herbicide in the adjacent field. The fact that the Nebraska population does seem stable 20 years, and since I have been watching, our population has been stabilized again. I think long-lived plants aren't really known for going up and down the way my annual plants did, but I do think we have unusual, it takes a special year for there to be a lot of seedlings. Most years there just aren't. And any population is vulnerable to a big outside force like herbicides. But yeah, we're grizzly bears.
Wondering if part of the issue might be a spatial sampling effect. In other words, you found that population enrichment because it was large. There was a lot of things and you chose that one. But if that was at the peak end of a population fluctuation, basically, the only thing you could do is decline from that. And that what you may be seeing now is more typical, but you would never have started the study if there were so few plants originally. So that could potentially be what's going on there. And it may be the populations kind of blink in and out and slowly move around the landscape over time.
That the overall not in my plots population has also, did the same decline. So it wasn't just a matter that I did wonder, okay, if they tumbled, the plots were placed randomly in Transic, but okay, if they just all moved, a few meters that way, and that was not the case. But it is possible that the population, but if that's true, there is no, now this is not part of a metapopulation. It's surrounded by a reservoir and agricultural fields. So there's nobody that's going to tumble in, and there's no place to tumble to for it to recover.
You mentioned dormancy. Is that a factor here? Could it be a longer period of dormancy that you don't know about?
So I definitely think that there were plants dormant when I went back in 2014, because there were a lot that showed up in 2015, and they weren't just seedlings. So okay, it would be really unusual for a plant to be able to store reserves to make it go more than 2 whole growing seasons as a plant. They can survive as seeds, and we have documentation. There's a seed bank of these, but as a root, it would be really unusual. Ellen,
So this really reminds me of milkweed, and so some of you know we did long-term studies on that. This whole idea of incomplete detection, that is what you're studying is in all of the ones out there. We had plants that would bark plants, and over several, we would have one, we saw the plant, and then 0, 0, 0, we didn't see the plant, and then finally we see the plant again. And I was very fortunate to get help from animal ecologist incorporating complete detection of the population models and made a huge difference. So I think that would be the biggest thing. We found it not only between years, but one year we went out and did multiple surveys over time and found plants that we saw and then we didn't see and then we saw again. And by really looking at them, they had been chopped off and then came back. So I bet that's a huge aspect.
I agree.
But it's tricky.
There's a couple questions on Zoom.
Okay,
I can read them to you.
Okay.
One is, if prairie turnips could be funded, would it be worth putting out trail cams to see if they're above ground herbivores aside from livestock eating on the non?
so the question was, would it be, if they were funded, would it be worth putting out trail cams to see who's eating them? And sure. But I, pay for some of my time first, but that I would definitely like to see. They are palatable. Unlike many members of this family, they don't have toxic compounds, but that seemingly wouldn't be adaptive if you're only above ground for such a short period of time. So they're not protecting themselves by. So they are tasty things. Eat them. We've never seen good evidence of root borers on any of the ones that I've dug, but they definitely get weevils. So what else we got in line?
Are we finding prairie turnips on heavily disturbed areas, river floodplains today, or mostly in relatively intact upland grass?
So there are the only places where they've been really successfully grown are in undisturbed grasslands, pastures where there's some inaccessible corner that the cattle aren't getting to. There was a movement in the 1800s to grow them as replacement for both potatoes and wheat in France. And yeah, someone didn't realize that you can grow potatoes in a single season. And devoting the same land to prairie turnips, you get much less stuff at 5 years than you would at 1. So they still make lots of internet lists of plants for the future, sustainable agriculture. They're not agriculturally commodifiable.
I found my first one 2 years after I left the university on a mowed hay meadow in Butler County. And I'm thinking, is there a difference for finding these? I mean, a hay meadow timing wise might work out really nicely. In that, they mowed it the year before, so it was really short grass when they popped up.
Yes, that my Nebraska site was normally, it's an interior hay meadow, and the year that they didn't mow because of drought, the next year it was so hard to find those plants. But I knew where to look, and so I did find them. But if you're just observing, haying definitely leads to.
And you didn't tell us what they taste like.
I never do, because it's usually the first question, and it always comes up as it's a nice softball first question. I have had them fresh, and they taste. It's more of a textural sensation. I say unroasted peanut or a raw green bean. They're chompy and have a little bit of beaniness to them. I've also eaten members of the genus with bigger, weirder roots in Oklahoma with our field team that tasted like boiled wood. No matter how long we boiled it. And we would grind them and put them, for my dissertation talk, I put them into little pancakes. And you could taste it. It was a little different than wheat flour.
I'm wondering, have you dropped in like in the fall or anything and checked on any of your sites?
Oh yeah.
And you haven't noticed like any, like increasing like warming periods, like could activate, the degree day count or something. And so like, are they blooming twice? And that's why you're seeing like dormancy happening.
No, these are, they're pretty well adapted to stay dormant. That in the, during my dissertation time, I was out very regularly doing the disturbance plots and seeing how the community changed, and never saw any indication of a plant